Welcome everyone, and it's good to see you all here. I apologize, there were some technical issues that made it difficult for some of you to find us today. I apologize for that frustration. But today we have the special opportunity to hear two individuals who have devoted their lives to the intersection between Buddhism and psychology, discuss their experiences and their viewpoints arrived at through all those many years. We will be hearing a dialogue between Dr. David Brazier and Dr. Yaya De Andrade. Dr. Brazier is an author, scholar, educator, and practitioner of psychotherapy. Dr. De Andrade, Yaya, is a lifelong psychotherapist who has worked especially in areas of trauma related to both natural and man-made disasters throughout the world, both on site and virtually. So I look forward, as I'm sure you all do, to hearing this discussion about Buddhist psychology and its applications. And without taking up any more time, I'll turn this over to Dr. Brazier and Dr. De Andrade. If you'll just give me a moment to do the necessary adjustments here. Thank you, Dharma Vidya. So carry it away.
Yes, well, we haven't planned this very carefully, but I always have a good time with Yaya, so I'm expecting that a spontaneous performance will work okay. Do you want to say anything right at the beginning, Yaya? I'm sure you do.
I have to contextualize. I am a student of Buddhist psychology, and Dave is my mentor. And I'm glad that there is no pass or fail. However, I, give you the beginning.
Yaya's being rather modest here because she has an enormous lifetime of experience of working with very difficult psychological situations. But perhaps I can begin by giving a little bit of definition. What do we mean by Buddhist psychology? Because sometimes people mean a kind of cross-fertilization of Western psychology and Buddhism. And of course, in many different ways that you can do that, because there's many different varieties of Buddhism, and there's many different varieties of Western psychology. So you could have, I don't know, Jungian psychology and Tibetan Buddhism, or behavioral psychology and Zen Buddhism, and so on. There's many permutations are possible. And of course, there's quite a lot of literature of that type around. What I mean by Buddhist psychology is perhaps slightly different from what Yaya means. I think she'll tell you, but I think broadly, Yaya means psychology done in a Buddhist spirit. And she'll fill that in. What I mean is that the Buddha gave many teachings during his lengthy life, and particularly immediately after he died, but then continuing throughout Buddhist history, people wanted to understand what were the kind of principles inherent in how he did his teaching. Because most of his, although he did sometimes give a sort of set piece lecture and say, come here, I've got something to say, and listen carefully. Most of the time, most of his teachings were given during dialogues. Somebody would come to see him, a bit as though a person might come and consult a psychologist or a therapist or whatever nowadays. People would come and see the Buddha, and they'd ask him questions, or they'd put some proposition, or they'd tell him about their life or whatever. And he would respond. And often as a result of these interactions, people were greatly inspired or changed, or issues were resolved like that. So afterwards, people, after his life particularly, people wanted to know, how did he do it? We're still asking, we're still burrowing into that question. How did he do it? Out of this came a lot of theorizing and reflecting and so on. And this produced a body of literature, which was called the Abhidhamma. And the Abhidhamma is kind of the world's first psychology books. So I've made a study of these over my time, but not particularly from a sort of scholastic point of view, so much as how do you apply this nowadays? How does all this wealth of material, this sort of cornucopia of early thinking about the mind, how can it affect us and apply and so on nowadays? And some of the books I've written have been based on my attempts to answer this question. I can't claim to have said the last word on it by a long way, but you have the fruits of my cogitations and so on. So it is, as Will said, it's been a sort of lifelong interest and pursuit. And for many years, I was a social worker, psychiatric social worker, psychotherapist. And all the time I was working at, how do you apply these ideas? How is it the same? You can say, how is it the same? How is it different from Western psychology? But how do you apply Buddhism in this way? Because I think most people think of Buddhism, they immediately think meditation, and they think of this essentially, even though you might do it in a group, they think of it as an individual practice in which an individual works on their own mind. But when you look at the actual stories and history of the Buddha's life and so on, and of most of the great masters ever since, certainly nearly all the Zen masters, when you look at their stories, virtually none of them were enlightened while meditating. Nearly all of them were enlightened as a result or during an interpersonal encounter, a meeting with a teacher, a master, or with some other kind of meeting. And these meetings precipitated some big change in the person and in their life. Well, nowadays it's an interpersonal interaction that brings about a major positive change in a person's life. I think we would refer to as a therapy, and we would see it as having relevance to psychology. So the question, how did the Buddha do it, is the riddle. And what comes from that then is how do we do it now? Is is there something we can do now that fits in with this received wisdom from ages past, that's been revised and refined down the centuries? So this is my sort of idea of Buddhist psychology, and in my life it's been applied both in doing one-to-one psychotherapy and doing group work, and also in quite a lot of socially engaged Buddhism in Bosnia immediately after the civil war there, with refugees in India, and so on. Yaya has even more experience of this kind, though she probably didn't do it directly from a Buddhist perspective. Yaya, would you like to say a few things?
Yes, well, thanks, David. Again, I think most of you in this group already know some of my stories because I already share once a year. A couple of things that you said that I probably would like to comment. One is that I remember many, many years ago meeting Rogers, who was a psychologist. And he said it was very strange when he heard people saying they were Rogerians psychotherapists. And I thought, wow, it is clever, because we always trained to become a Freudian psychoanalyst or a Jungist, analyst, or again, it's emulating someone that we believe had a wisdom in some level. And we could then transmit that wisdom in our work. One of the things that, Dave and I know for many decades now, and one of the things that really attracted me, the kind of Amida Buddhism that he taught us or continued to teach us was, again, as he mentioned, the engaged Buddhism. Maybe because of my nature, and again, as a Western trained psychologist from Brazil, we are really engaged. And sometimes we are called subversive. I was called a very subversive psychologist many times. And again, because you engage, you allow people to perceive some of the constraints that happen to them because of, again, as the Buddhists say, things arise in dependence upon conditions. There were conditions in people's life that make them very paranoid, and it's not paranoid as a psychiatric definition or categories, because they were at risk, they were in danger. Then my work was really in the sense, like David mentioned, I probably was a psychologist, and unconsciously I had a Buddhist spirit in some way, making people not necessarily liberated of their dukkha, but being aware that dukkha happened. It's like a headache, And I like to always say, like, to people, when emotions are unsettling, it's like a little light, red light in your dashboard in the car. There's something wrong, but you don't know what it is. And how we perceive this, and how we perceive it, not necessarily in a way everything is controllable and everything is fixable, but it's real. And that's how I feel my training as a Western psychologist really believe that dukkha in certain situations, especially in situations like a disaster, for example, it's far more complex than just the day-to-day hindrances that we have to cope with. Again, I was known as someone who was a trauma psychologist, and sometimes I would work with children, and I would go to a school, and immediately people would say, Yaya is here, somebody probably died. She came to talk to us. And it was kind of a doom situation. But however, I always feel that my intent was to inspire and to change people and to make them realize that they do have a joie de vivre, even if it was like getting kids hot chocolate, and then they will be talking about things. Then again, I think interpersonal encounters is where I learned things, even though I read all kinds of books, like most of you who were trained as Western psychologists did. Then I don't think, as a psychologist, I had, the ability to really come into a situation with something ready. I think I came with my mind and my heart open, and I learned a lot, and the people engaged in those situations, and we all learn together.
Yeah. Yes, you said that situations, states, processes arise in dependence upon conditions. And that this very fundamental kind of Buddhist principle. Some of those conditions are, we might say, external. Some of the situations that Yaya's worked in, that I've worked in, certainly external conditions were very much impinging. But then there's internal conditions, and there's how we respond to the conditions that arise, both those external conditions and the ones that arise within us. We might, in Buddhism, say through a karmic process, things arise within us. And how do we respond to all that? It brings to mind a time when I was sitting in a little kitchen in Sarajevo and talking to a woman there, and she told me the story of the siege, the time when she was in Sarajevo for 3 years. The city was under siege, constant bombardment. You see the sort of pictures that you see of the Ukraine. That was going on in Bosnia. And she was in this block of flats surviving this time. And she started to talk about it. And I remember the first and last thing she said in this story. And the first thing she said was, I would never have believed that people could be so cruel. And the last thing she said was, I'm glad that I lived through the siege. Now, the juxtaposition of these two statements is quite powerful. People can be very cruel. Conditions can be very bad. People are dying all around you. Quite a number of people in the same block of flats were killed during this period. The room where I was staying at that time, this was only a year after the war had stopped, there were still bullets in the walls. I would never have known people could be so cruel. But I'm glad I lived through this, through the event. The going through this dukkha, this great trial, this dreadful circumstance, had lifted her whole life and mentality to a new level. It reminds me of what the famous quotation from Jean-Paul Sartre, the French existentialist, who said, we were most free when we were most oppressed. Because at those times, every day you made life and death decisions. Whereas at other times you just made decisions about whether to have 3 bottles of milk or 2 bottles of milk in the fridge. Trivia. So sometimes our life is by conditions switch to a great intensity. And at those times of dukkha, it can go different ways. This can be the making of a person, or it can be the breaking of a person. At such times, people can rise to a great spirit, to a great heroism, can have new insights into the nature of life and the universe and everything. Other people are crushed. Their spirit is broken. They never really recover. It's too much. Buddhism starts from a reflection upon this issue. It starts from the reflection of dukkha and how the energy that comes from dukkha, from challenge, from adverse conditions, can be what sets us on a cycle of just creating more and more and more dukkha, revenge, all manner of bad things. We suffer, we decide we are led to make others suffer. This is very common. But it can also be the gateway to the path, to the spiritual path, to a new life, to a more vital, more liberated, more open-hearted, like that. And as a psychologist, of course, you come in at the other end of this sort of process. You can hear the story of somebody's story, and empathically you can think, yes, well, if I was in their shoes and I'd been through what they've been through, I could well be just as they are. And perhaps they're depressed or anxious or obsessive or whatever it is. But you also know that there are some people who have been through exactly the same circumstances and have thrived, have come away lifted. This is a very interesting phenomenon, and it was the first teaching of the Buddha, that out of dukkha, if it's responded to in one way, comes more dukkha. Out of dukkha, if it's responded to in a different way, comes the Eightfold Path. And how do you make the difference? I think sometimes the difference comes from the courage and inspiration that we get from others, from being with somebody. In my experience over the years, the times when people make the biggest sort of, I don't know, it's a meaningful phrase to say, but forward movement spiritually is when there is some combination of difficulty and inspiration coming at the same time. And this is, of course, why therapy is often very valuable, because you at a time of difficulty, you come to see somebody who provides safety, perhaps inspiration, and this makes the difference. How do you make the difference, Yaya?
I wish. Well,
you bring chocolate. You bring hot chocolate. This is
does make a big difference. Or little turkey soup, because turkey. Do you know that around the Thanksgiving, it's great because turkey release serotonin. It's a great turkey soup is the best for kids. But in a serious note, you mentioned about process arising. And again, the dependence upon conditions, and this can be external or internal. And I am one who believes that there is an external reality and that there is an internal reality. And if these two things don't match, people are called, maybe they're very crazy. They think they're Napoleon.
Yes.
But again, the whole idea is, as much as possible, that we entertain our internal reality in kind of harmony with the external reality. Unfortunately, the external reality can be brutal, and people very easily internalize the brutality of that reality. Other times, maybe, I don't know how, but it's internal. It's not necessarily external. People get totally overwhelmed by feelings of depression and anxiety that not necessarily match their reality, their external reality to the eye. Then that for me, I think, was a big challenge as a therapist, and how we responded to those kind of situations. And it's interesting, I was this week giving a workshop in my work, like at Red Cross, and I came with an acronym called MAP, M-A-P. And just because we as virtual team use what they call the MAP VOT, then I thought MAP would be a good metaphor for them, or acronym for them to remember. And these are the three things that I always feel in my work. And one is the mastering. How people master, meaning how people acknowledge we have control over certain things and certain things we don't have control. And I learn a lot by work with indigenous people, because indigenous people have what they call circles of courage. And that is how you learn about life. I developed something that calls circles of support in contravention with circles of silence, because again, I learned that circles of silence are happening in very dictatorships and situations where people cannot speak, in families when you know a family in which one person may abuse a child in the evening, and next morning they are all at breakfast and nobody speak. Then there is a circle of silence that people also internalize. Then the risks is this: what do we internalize and make our reality? And again, going back to the indigenous, the circles of courage is not just about mastering, but it's about attention, being attentive. And I think that's a very Buddhist quality, being attentive to what is going on, the nature. Like I remember like talking about the mountains and the rivers. I mean, it was fascinating. Look at my lake in front of my house all the time. Now I think, nature has a life, and how attentive we are, and how attentive we are in our own internal reality. And the third thing is being positive. I am a positive person. Being positive perspective imply having faith, and I don't know how to teach people faith, but they have hope and all kinds of things. And again, just because, I put a little thing about my work in Sri Lanka, but in disaster, for me, you follow what happened in terms of the structure of a disaster. That is, the initial stage is to respond to what happened. The second stage is to recover. And the third stage is to rebuild. And that for me is how therapy works in a way. In some level, you respond to things, and we are responding by active listening, by facilitating the exploration by the client. And then the next stage would be how this person recover for things, and then how you may rebuild it. Then I think, what you said is very true. There is a process arising, and the process arising implies in how we manage those things with somebody, meaning that person is the key to engage in that process, not me as a therapist, but allowing a safe grounds and a safe context for that person to be able to do it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, you mentioned the importance of attentiveness and attention there as a Buddhist quality, and Buddhism provides on the Buddhist psychology program that we're both tutors on. We have a whole load of experiential exercises for people to look at how attention is conditioned. And the Buddhist psychology, the Buddhist theories, provide models of how the mind works, of how one thing leads to another in the mind, and how the way that we are conditioned, the sort of things that Yaya has just been talking about, shape the way we then pay attention to the world. And what we nowadays in the West would probably call mental health is quite substantially a function of how we pay attention, what we pay attention to, what things in our world have power over us, hold our attention, and so on. And even in everyday life, in one of the things I like about Buddhist psychology, just in parentheses, is that the same principles apply when you're talking about how you respond to the Bosnian War as how you respond to cutting a loaf in the kitchen. You know, the little things of life and the big things, the principles are much the same. But what do you pay attention to? How do you pay attention to something? What is it that catches your attention? Why does it catch your attention? How is your mind structured in such a way that that particular thing catches your attention? I can give you a kind of trivial, simple example that that shows this. The other day, just a couple of days ago, I visited a pottery. And you know how it is. You go into a pottery showroom and there's lots of pots. And your eye is drawn to one thing or another. Quite naturally, you see something. Perhaps if you've gone in with another person and you've been there for 10 minutes and then you went outside and the other person said, "Did you see those vases on such and such a shelf?" You'd say, "No, were there?" I was looking at the urns on the two different people had different things that caught their attention. Why? I walked into this pottery shop and my eye was caught by some vases in the far corner, which were rather brightly colored. And I walked past some other pottery. I suppose I sort of must have quickly clicked off as dull. And I went to these bright ones, you see. Bright colors catch your eye. I wonder why. And I'm looking at the bright ones and I start having discussion with the potter. He's standing in the room and we're chatting and this and that and how did you get into pottery and how long have you been here and the sort of things you talk about. And he said, amongst other things, "Well, I learnt my pottery from a Chinese potter." And when he said this, I sort of thought, oh, yes, well, that's interesting. And I cast my eye around the shop with a new, what can you say, a new pair of specs on, as it were, because I'm now looking at them in the context of my own prior thinking and feeling about China and Chinese pottery and Chinese art. And my eye then lit upon one of those really dull pots that I'd walked past. And in my previous mind state had not seen at all. And now I saw this sort of gray-green glaze, which is so characteristic of classic Chinese pottery. And I thought, yes. And I bought one of those. But I'm sure if the gentleman had not said that he'd been trained by a Chinese potter, I would never have slipped into that mentality. And so my attention would never have gone to that particular pot in that kind of way. So this is about how attention is shaped by the mentality. But then there's another step, you see, which is that this pot is now actually sitting just over there on my on my mantelpiece. And in a very small way, I'm sure it contributes to my sense of myself as somebody who has studied Chinese civilization and feels an affinity for it. And it's a little tiny Lego brick in my sense of self, you see? So things get built into our sense of who we are by these kinds of processes. And perhaps if I was a fully enlightened Buddha, I would have given up my sense of self and so on. But Buddhist psychology is much more about how these principles are applied to ordinary people like me who are not enlightened at all, and how they might better and enhance my life. Whereas Buddhist practice, in theory at least, is aimed at complete ultimate enlightenment. Buddhist psychology is more about the everyday, the ordinary person, and in some ways about the reasons why we're not enlightened, why I keep on reinforcing my sense of self by buying Chinese pots, where if I was a good Buddhist monk, I probably do no such thing. I don't know if that triggers anything for you, Yaya, but it's just a little incident from just a couple of days ago.
Well, I'm kind of going to connect what you're saying about the self and a little bit of connection that you made with who you are and all the things that you acquire in your life, knowing about China and studying, with a question that somebody asked. And I will read here. Well, everybody read the question, right? About the intergenerational transmission of trauma in Buddhism. Then I would speak about what I understand in terms of psychology, and you may speak in terms of what you understand in Buddhism. Then my understanding, if I think about it, is go back about the self. We have an identity, and our identity can be bruised in ways that is very difficult to overcome the impact of that bruise. As you know, I work with, again, indigenous people, and they have an incredible history of cruelty towards them. And to this day, they would relate it to that history as really dear to their heart. And very much like a Jewish may think of the Holocaust as something very cruel, very horrible. And that in some way shadow their sense of who they were in the world and how they were perceived. And again, being destroyed when you belong to someone and your identity, how do you let go this? How you let go identity? And that's where Buddhism keeps saying, like, how you let go attachments, how you let go identity, the self, the ego. I think is a very complicated process in my perspective. But I'm not someone who knows, for example, a lot of historical facts, like my grandmother was Russian, and I'm sure that she came as a Jewish person persecuted, but that does not make who I am today. It doesn't affect me in that way for some reason. I don't know why. But I want to tell a story that you are going to think is very strange.
Can I interrupt you a second? Do you really not know why, or do you have some sense why that doesn't affect you?
No, I don't think of me as being a person with a history. I think about young archetypes. We all go back to the indigenous. We have responsibility. We should today be so smart and not doing all the things that people are doing out there, because we carry on all this knowledge, all this experience of who knows how many hundreds of years. Then that's what I think. We are little nothing, but you have the responsibility of that. But what I understand in terms of how people suffer because of that, and thanks, Peggy. We have to acknowledge that suffering. I acknowledge that suffering. I'm not saying it's wrong, but I want to tell you a story. We in Canada, we have a person in a political position that called the Governor General. And the Governor General is appointed by the Queen. I mean, he's not appointed by the Queen. The governor, appointed by the Prime Minister, and that person represents the Queen of England in Canada. Canada has that. So what is more intriguing is the current Governor General is a First Nation woman. It's very unknown to people how this happened. So here comes the royals come here and they meet the First Nations that tell all these horrible things that England did, took their land, never paid, and left them, and blah, blah, blah. It's a very historical shame that they really pointing out now more than ever, because I live in this country 50 years plus, and I never saw so active acknowledgement of that history as now. But look at this. This person then goes to England and then go to visit the Queen. The Queen then is showing one of the palaces. I don't know where is this happened, but in this place, there was a table with a glass. And under the glass, there was what's supposed to be a white shirt, but the shirt was not white. The shirt was kind of brownish stains like. And then this person asked the Queen, "Oh, what is this shirt about?" The Queen turns and say, "It's a reminder. I also belong to, this is my ancestor. I also belong to someone who was tortured and murdered in a cruel way," or something like that. It was like one of those kings, probably, I don't know where, that this happened, he was beheaded. But the way the Queen said, according to this woman, was almost to acknowledge that everybody has history. And it reminded me, Will told once a story. Remember the woman whose son died and she went to see the Buddha? And the Buddha said, "Go and collect whatever seeds, if you find it." Yeah, that means we all have history of cruelty.
Yeah, it's a big issue. The question of transmission from generation to generation or from person to person and so on is obviously embedded in the conditions that people create for one another. If you have certain experiences in your history, then it's quite likely, it's not inevitable, nothing in Buddhism is inevitable, but there is a propensity towards the possibility that you will create those conditions for another person. And this, of course, happens, and traumas are carried from person to person, but they're also carried by whole cultures and civilizations. Buddhism in the West is not the same as Buddhism in the East. And people in the West who've taken up Buddhism are very much concerned with certain particular issues and problems that don't preoccupy people in the East. They have other preoccupations and problems. These are because they have different histories and different conditions have been passed down to them. We in the West, for instance, just to give an instance, we're very much, you will read in your Buddhist books that you pick up, you'll read endless amounts of stuff about duality and non-duality. Why is this a preoccupation of Western culture? probably none of the people who read this and read it and get excited about it, well, few are conscious of the fact that in the 12th, 13th century, Europe experienced a most bloody and awful cultural trauma, which was the crusade against the Cathars, who were dualists. And the Catholic Church murdered them all. And this is a great trauma and guilt in the history of our civilization. Now, most people are totally unaware of this source, but I'm fairly convinced that this is one of the reasons why the issue of duality and non-duality rises in our minds as something really important, where to a Chinese person, it's just a dusty fact in a Chinese, in a Buddhist book on the shelf, but it's not something that animates them to any great extent. Their culture is different. They have other cruelties. So traumas, if we like to call them that, great disasters, leave their mark on a whole civilization, not just on individuals. But again, as I said earlier, the same circumstance can be taken in very different ways. And a lot of the substance or purpose of Buddhist practice is to bring us to a state where we are not the repeaters of what we have received. In the sort of very simple, common phenomena, dukkha happens, and we respond to it in a way that repeats, that creates more dukkha, that keeps the cycle going. This cycle is called samsara. Buddhism is, in principle, about how you get off that cycle, how you have the faith, or the nerve, you might say, to not go along with the repetition. Everything, almost everything in human life, in the psychology of life, not in the physical circumstances, but in the psychology of life, most things are capable of some sort of reversal. The reversal is like driving a motorcycle at 100 miles an hour. For one person is terrifying, for another person is really exciting. Excitement and terror are physiologically almost identical, but one experience is received very differently from the other. Many things are like that. They're capable of a reversal. This is the kind of Buddhist notion of what's sometimes called sudden awakening, that you can suddenly see things in a new way, in a different way. What are the conditions in which you might see things in a suddenly in a new way? Well, they're the sort of things you might expect, that you are in a safe environment with people you trust who are inspiring. So we talk about refuge in the Sangha and so on. You receive wise teachings from people who have put them into practice, not just read them in a book. These things, these are Buddhist practice. Buddhist practice has that aim of getting us off the cycle, getting us out of simple repetition, and therefore away from creating the conditions that make something go on and on and on and on and on. We have this figure of Quan Shi Yin, the Bodhisattva of compassion. The name Quan Shi Yin literally means the one who hears the cries that come down the generations. The nature of compassion is to act in such ways that we do not transmit again into the next generation, into the next group of people, and so on. But the normal, the common situation is that we do. Commonly we do. And this is the great sadness. This is a great grief of the human situation. In sort of small print, Yaya and I have sometimes had discussions about whether this word trauma is a useful word. And obviously it does have some use, and its use in psychology goes back to Freud. But the way we use it nowadays, I have some fear that we have made it so, like everything's a trauma. And there's a sense with trauma. Trauma sort of implies damage, and it has a kind of implication of something that is not repairable. And I don't like that idea. I like to think that things are repairable. Things can be changed. I don't like to think of people as damaged. People have certain conditions, certain circumstances, certain patterns, but these are changeable. I always think that way. So, but of course, words mean different things to different people. So.
I see a little different, if I may, because a couple of things you said, I really totally agree, like, this whole idea of experience. And I had, just like to remember one experience I was going to mention in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka, before the tsunami, there was the area where I was an area that there was a civil war with the Tamils and the Sinhalese. And when the tsunami hit, these people have to be in a camp all together. And it was an incredible experience for me to be able to acknowledge the importance of this new cycle of community in which these people now are together. If I had this, I don't think we have time to share something. But what I want to make a point is you said about trauma, and yes, I think when you have compassion, and you do have the responsibility to tell people, in my view, that there is no cure. I learned with a Buddhist monk from Cambodia, trauma, he said this word in Khmer that I don't remember, it means it's something that happened to your sense, like in your skin, through your eyes, through your body, and get into your body inside and go to your blood system and go to your heart, and only get out of your system when your heart stops. Then that's why I created this thing that I call model of care, not a model of cure. It's same like dukkha. I don't believe it that there is a model of cure. It's like a headache. Can you say you never have a headache again? No. For me, it's like a model of care, how we care for the things that happen to us and to other people in a way that is, again, with a compassion, reversing this cycle that is. And for me, it's very much like discrimination. People who discriminated people is because they don't have an experience with people. And when they have, they stop some of those ideas about people from different color, different ethnicity, different religion. Then I think we cannot be dogmatic in any way. You have to be very open mind and open heart. And that's what is very hard, because, you wanted to make clear to people that you want to stop or help them, their suffering. But it's not easy, because I think it's far more complex than we think.
Yes.
Thank you. I'm going to, I didn't mute you, did I, Yaya?
Sorry, I thought maybe people want to ask questions.
Oh, I was actually, yes, thank you. And we are getting near the end of our time, but I'm going to plead with everyone here to give us another 10 minutes. Since we had 10 minutes with my trying to figure out some of the technicalities of making this work, and I'm glad I'm glad that happened. But I would really I really regret that 10 minutes. So if it's okay with everyone, we'll quit at 10 after noon our time, and instead of just right at noon.
You can
And
take
I
the
want to give
highlights
some
off
time.
us.
Pardon me?
You can take the highlights off, and we all participated.
Oh, okay. That may take another 10 minutes.